fourth topic is about psychological perspective. Introduction is me, myself, and I. The psychological of the self focuses on the representation of an individual based on his experience. These experiences are either from home, schools, or other groups, organization, or affiliations she or he engaged in. Seemingly, the self is one of the most heavily researched ideas in social and personality psychology, where the concepts are introduced that beyond our physical attributes lies our psychological identity. The cogn- Let's discuss about the self as a cognitive construction. Cognitive construction is a cognitive approach that focuses on the mental process rather than the observable behavior. This approach will assist individuals in assimilating new information to their existing knowledge and will enable the appreciation modification to their existing intellectual framework to accommodate their new information. According to William James and me, self, I, with the initiative of William Ward, the father of scientific psychology, scientific methods of studying that are mentioned as phenomenon of the consciousness urge interest in further studies of the self and its role in human behaviors. It is the time that William James' classic distinction between the self as knower or a pure ego and the self known as or the imperial self provides a usual frame within which to view the multitudinous aspects of self-functioning. And now, let's discuss about material self. Material self consists of things that belongs to us or what we belong to. Things like family, clothes, our body, and money are some of what makes up our material selves. Number two is social self. Our social selves are who are we in given social situation. For James, people can change, they act depending on the social situation that they are in. James believed that people had as many social selves as they had social situation they participated in. Lastly, the spiritual self is who we are at the core. The spiritual self is more concrete or permanent than the other two selves. The spiritual self is our subjective and most intimate self. Aspects of an individual's spiritual self includes things like his/her personality, core values and conscience that do not typically change throughout a lifetime. Global versus differentiated models. There have been many postulations that one's self may be fragmented into different parts and different selves, which may be in conflict or needs regulation from each others. Although James gave a very interesting perspective on the self and was even among the first writers to coin the term self-esteem. Other theories emerged to study on the selfhood as an integrated part of one's psyche. In the past 30 years, self-esteem has become deeply embedded in popular culture. It is the person's overall self-evaluation or sense of self-worth. Global versus differential models. Global self-esteem, aka trait self-esteem, is a personality variable that represents the way people generally feel about themselves. It It is relatively enduring across time and situations. According to researchers, global self esteem is a decision people make about their worth as a person. State self esteem, aka feeling of self worth, refers to the temporary feelings or momentary emotional reaction to the positive and negative events where we feel good or bad about ourselves during this situation or experience. The main specific self-esteem or self-evaluation is focused on how people evaluate their various abilities and attributes. This is making distinction or differentiation on how good or bad people are in a specific physical attributes, abilities, and personal characters. Real and idea self-concept. The self as the regulating center of the individual's personality and self-process under the guise of ID, ego, and superego functioning, rock psychology as the biggest picture in understanding the psychological self. From this milestone, prominent psychologists followed with their own perspective of the self to contest the rules of functions of ego as the self. There were the landmarks of contemporary psychology and the understanding of internal process of a man. A group of psychologists called the renewed attention to inner experience, internal process, and self-constructs. This perspective asserts the overall dignity and worth of humans being as their capacity for self-realization. Karen Horney, with her feminine psychology, established that a person has an ideal self, actual self, and the real self. She believed that everyone experienced basic anxiety, which we experience conflict and strive to cope and employ tension reduction approaches. Hall mentioned that Hermey believed people develop a number of strategies to cope with basic anxiety because people feel inferior. An ideal self-image is an imaginary picture of the self as the possessor of unlimited powers and superlative qualities is developed. On the other hand, the actual self is the person in one's everyday life is often despised because it fails to fulfill the requirements of the ideal's image. Underlying the both ideal self and actual self is the real self, which is revealed only as a person begins to shade the various techniques developed to deal with the basic anxiety and to find ways resolving conflicts. The real self is not an entity but a force that implies growth and self-realization. Carl Rogers, with his person-centered theory, established a conception of self involving the real self or the self-concept and idea self. The idea self includes all those aspects of one's being and one's experience that are perceived in awareness by the individuals. It is the part of ourselves where we feel, think, look, and act involving our self-image. On the other hand, the ideal self revolves around goals and ambitions in life. It's dynamic and idealized image that we have developed over time. This is what our parents have taught us considering that we admire in others, what society promotes, what we think are in our best interest. A wide gap between the ideal self and the real self indicates incongruence and an unhealthy personality. If the way what I am, the real self, is aligned with the way that I want to be, is the ideal self, then I will feel a sense of mental well being or peace of mind. If the way that I am is not aligned with how I want to be, the incongruence of, or lack of alignment will result in mental distress or anxiety. The greater the level of incongruence between the ideal and real self, the greater is multiple versus unified self. Postmodern psychology contends that a man has identified that shifts and morphs in different situations and in response to different stimuli. As Kenneth Gurdon argues that having a flexible sense of self in different contexts is more socially adaptable than force oneself to stick to one self context. Theorists believe that there is no one answer to the question, who am I? As one person can undergo several transitions in his life and create multiple versions of himself, however, there is still constatation of the importance of mental well-being of maintaining a unified, centralized, coherent self. Multiple selves, according to Kenneth Gordon, are the capacities we carry within us from multiple relationships. These are not discovered but created in our relationship with the other people. The unified selves, strongly pointed out in traditional psychology, emphasize that well-being comes when our personality dynamics are congruent, cohesive, and consistent. It is understood that a person is essentially connected with selfhood and identity. In a healthy person, the ego remains at the helm of the mind, coherent, are organized, staying at the center. The true versus false self. Donald Winnicott distinguished that what he called the true self from the false self in the human personality, considering the true self as based on a sense of being an experiencing body and the false self as a necessary defensive organization, a survival kit, a caretaker self, the means by which threatened person has managed to survive. The true self has a sense of integrity, of connected wholeness that harks to the early stage. False self is used when the person has to comply with external rules, such as being polite or otherwise following social codes. The false self constantly seeks to anticipate demands of others in order to maintain the relationships. The healthy false self is functional and can be compliant but without the feelings that it has betrayed its true self. The unhealthy false self fits in but through a feeling of forced compliance rather than loving adaptation. False selves, as investigated by Hens Conant, can lead towards narcissistic personality, which identifies with internal factors at the cost of one's own autonomous creativity. That was all about my report entitled Psychological Perspective.